The night my father shook hands with a man I'd never met and sold everything I'd built for 7 years, I was sitting in the parking garage 2 floors below the celebration. I could hear the music, some jazz trio they'd hired for the occasion. The sound floated down through the concrete, muffled but unmistakable, and I sat in my 2017 Civic with the seat pushed back and the engine off, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of my car like it owed me an explanation. I wasn't invited to the party. Let me back up. My name is Vera. I'm 31 years old, and for the better part of my 20s, I built a medical data platform called Meridian. From a single Python script I wrote on my kitchen table in a studio apartment in Austin, Texas, while eating ramen noodles I'd bought in bulk from Costco because I couldn't afford the good groceries anymore. Meridian was a clinical decision support system. What that means, in plain terms, is that hospitals and specialty clinics would upload their patient outcome data, anonymized, structured, and my platform would run it through a predictive model I'd trained and retrained for years, flagging high-risk cases before they became emergencies. It caught things, real things, renissions, sepsis risk, medication conflicts in complex patients. I had the case studies. I'd stayed on the phone at 11 at night with oncologists in Iowa who wanted to understand why the model had flagged a particular patient. I knew this system the way you know your own handwriting. My father's company, Garrett Med Group, yes, my father, Mr. Garrett, a man who had spent his entire career buying and selling small healthcare consulting firms, had agreed to be my early backer. $50,000 when I was 24. In exchange, I gave him 15% equity and the title of strategic advisor. It seemed reasonable at the time. He had the network. I had the product. What I didn't fully understand then, and what became the slow disaster of the next 7 years, was that my father didn't invest in me because he believed in Meridian. He invested in me because he believed he could eventually own Meridian. There's a difference. It took me a long time to feel it. My younger brother, whose name is Wade, had dropped out of 2 colleges by the time he was 22. Not for any dramatic reason, he just didn't like to finish things. He'd started a food blog, a drop-shipping business, and at one point a podcast about disruptive thinking that had 11 episodes and then disappeared. Wade was funny and charming and could work any room he walked into. He was also completely incapable of writing a line of code or reading a technical document without his eyes blazing over. My father adored him. When I was 26, my father suggested Wade come on as head of business development. I said I wasn't sure we needed that role yet. My father said it would be good for the company's image to have a face for client relationships. I said I was the face. He said I was the engineer. That sentence. I replayed it for years. I said yes because I thought it would keep the peace, and because I was 26 and still hoping that one day my father would look at me the way he looked at Wade, like a person whose potential was obvious and worth betting on. Wade started showing up to meetings I hadn't been invited to. He started signing off on client decks with his name at the top. He started being introduced at industry events as the co-founder of Meridian. I kept building. The model improved every quarter. By year 4, we had contracts with 3 regional hospital systems and a letter of intent from a national urgent care chain. Our ARR was just under $4 million. I was working 16-hour days, not because someone was making me, but because I could see what Meridian was becoming, and I didn't want to miss a single inflection point. I pressed the button to push a major model update at 2 in the morning on Thanksgiving while my mother was asleep down the hall at my parents' house in Dallas. I updated the production environment the day after my best friend's wedding, still in my bridesmaid dress, laptop open in the hotel room while everyone else went to the after party. I ran a critical patch from my phone in the parking lot of an urgent care clinic. Not one of ours, just the closest one. when I had strep throat and a fever of 102 and couldn't drive myself home. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because what came next only makes sense if you understand what I had given this company. Not just time, not just effort, myself, all of it. In year 6, a healthcare technology firm out of Chicago, a serious one, the kind with lobbyists and a board that included a former FDA commissioner, reached out about an acquisition. They weren't interested in Garrett Med Group. They were interested in Meridian. Specifically, they were interested in the predictive model, the training data pipeline, and the API architecture I'd built. My father brought me into a meeting and told me this was a generational opportunity. He said the number. I'll tell you it was north of $900 million, and he watched my face. I sat very still. I said I needed time to think and to have my attorney review any term sheets before we went further. He told me that was smart. He told me he was proud of me. 2 weeks later, I found out through our company's CFO, a woman named Ms. Odom, who I think was the only truly honest person in that entire organization, that my father had already signed a letter of intent without me. I'll let that land for a second. He had signed a letter of intent to sell Meridian to an acquiring company without telling me, without including me in the negotiation, without my signature. And when I went to him and said, "Dad, what did you do?" he sat back in his chair and said, "We did what was best for the company." I said, "You don't have the authority to do this alone." He said, "I have majority voting rights as of the restructuring last year." I had missed something. In the equity restructuring we'd done 18 months earlier, which I had reviewed quickly during a period when I was managing a major system migration and barely sleeping, my father had quietly shifted the voting share structure so that his 15% carried enough weight to unilaterally authorize major decisions. I had reviewed the document. I had not caught that clause. I sat in his office for a moment and didn't say anything. Then I said, "What about my role?" After the acquisition, he looked at his desk. Not at me, at his desk. And he said, "They're bringing in their own technical leadership. You'll be compensated for the transition." Compensated how? "We're offering you a standard buyout for your shares." I have 31%. Yes, that's a significant payout. It is, and my role, he finally looked at me. And this is the sentence I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "Vera, you built a great system. But Meridian is bigger than any one engineer now. Wade is going to stay on as head of product under the new structure. He has the relationships. He's the one they want in the room." I nodded slowly. I picked up my bag. I said, "Okay," and I walked out. I didn't cry until I got to the elevator. Then I stopped because I didn't want anyone to see. What I didn't tell my father in that meeting was something I had never told anyone in the company because it had never occurred to me that I would need to. When I originally built Meridian's core predictive model, the one that was now, apparently, worth the majority of a 9-figure acquisition price, I had trained it using a dataset I had personally compiled and curated over 2 years before the company even had a formal structure. I had scraped public health records, structured academic datasets, applied for research data access through my own credentials as a researcher at UT Austin, and spent hundreds of hours cleaning and labeling data in my apartment. That dataset, the foundational training corpus for the Meridian model, was registered under my personal name, not the company's. Mine. I had done this by accident initially. And then, at some point in year 2, when my father had started making comments that made me vaguely uneasy, nothing specific, just a feeling, I had quietly maintained that registration. I had paid the annual filing fees out of my own pocket. I had kept the documentation in a folder on my personal hard drive. I had never done anything with this information. I had hoped I would never need to. The morning after the meeting with my father, I called my attorney. Her name is not important, but she is very good and she does not panic, which is exactly what you want in a person when you are explaining that your father has sold your company without you. She asked me several questions. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me the dataset registration documents." I sent them. She called me back 2 hours later and said, "Vera, the model cannot function without this dataset. The acquiring company cannot legally deploy or modify the Meridian system without a license to this data." "I know," I said. "Your father does not know about this." "No." "Does anyone at the company know?" "No," she said. "Then we have a conversation to have." The acquisition closing ceremony was held at a private event space in downtown Austin, a glass-walled room on the 14th floor with a view of the city and an open bar and a jazz trio. I know this because Ms. Odom sent me a copy of the invite that had been sent to the entire company, which was strange because my email address had been removed from the company distribution list 3 days after my conversation with my father. I had already been quietly locked out of the company, Slack. My badge access to the office had been deactivated. I found out about the badge from a colleague who texted me, confused, when she tried to add me to a meeting and the system flagged my account as inactive. I was still, technically, a shareholder. No one had completed my buyout paperwork. I drove to the event space that evening, not because I was planning to walk in. I was not on the guest list, but because I needed to be close to what was happening. I don't entirely know how to explain that. It was my company. I wanted to at least be in the same building. I sat in the parking garage for 45 minutes. The jazz floated down. I ate a granola bar from my glove compartment and thought about the server update I'd pushed at 2 a.m. on Thanksgiving. Then my attorney called. She said the letter she had sent that afternoon, addressed to the acquiring company's general counsel with copies to my father's attorneys, had been received. She said there was significant alarm on their end. She said they needed to speak with me. I said, "Tonight?" She said, "They're asking if you can come up." I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The party was in the main room. I was brought into a side conference room by a woman in a gray blazer who did not introduce herself. 30 seconds later, a man in an extremely expensive suit came in and sat across from me. He was the acquiring company's chief legal officer. He said, "Ms. Garrett." I said, "Vera is fine." He opened a laptop. He turned it toward me. It was the dataset registration. He said, "Is this yours?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And the model cannot be retrained or deployed in production without access to this corpus?" I said, "Not in any meaningful commercial form. The architecture was built around this specific data structure. You'd need to start from scratch, which would take 2 to 3 years and approximately $8 to $12 million in data acquisition, assuming you could replicate the research access I had, which you can't, because some of those academic partnerships were personal to me." He stared at me for a long time. I waited. He said, "Who else knows about this?" I said, "My attorney." He said, "Your father represented in the acquisition documents that the company held full rights to all proprietary technology." I said, "My father was mistaken." He closed the laptop. He excused himself. He was gone for 11 minutes, I counted. When he came back, he said, "We'd like to propose a licensing conversation." "I'd like that too," I said. "My attorney will be in touch on Monday." He nodded and stood up to leave. Then he stopped at the door and said, almost as an afterthought, "How long have you had this?" I said, 7 years. "Almost exactly." He left. I sat in that conference room for a few minutes by myself. Through the wall, I could hear the jazz trio finish a song, and the room applaud. My father found me 20 minutes later in the hallway near the elevators. I don't know how he knew I was there. Maybe someone told him. His face was a color I had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, more like a man who has just realized the ground beneath him isn't solid. He said, "Vera, what did you do?" I said, "I protected my work." He said, "You could destroy this deal." I said, "You should have thought about that before you signed without me." He said, "We are your family." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the Thanksgiving update. I thought about the bridesmaid dress. I thought about the 102-degree fever in the urgent care parking lot. I thought about the night I stayed on the phone until 1 in the morning with a hospital in Iowa while my father was probably asleep in his comfortable house in Dallas having dinner with Wade. I said, "Good night, Dad." I pressed the elevator button. He kept talking. I watched the numbers count up, and I didn't say another word. Wade found me in the lobby. He was holding a glass of champagne, and he looked confused, which was his most frequent expression. He said, "What's happening?" "Dad looks freaked out." I said, "The deal has some complications." He said, "What kind of complications?" I said, "The technical kind, the kind you don't understand." He blinked. I walked past him and out through the revolving door. The next 8 weeks were not simple. Deals at this scale are never simple, especially when a licensing dispute surfaces in the middle of a closing. There were depositions. There were conference calls with attorneys at 9 in the morning and at 9 at night. My father's lawyers pushed back hard at first, claiming the dataset had been developed using company resources and therefore belonged to the company. My attorney produced the original university research access credentials, the personal hard drive timestamps, and 2 years of filing receipts paid from my personal checking account. The claim didn't survive contact with the documentation. In the end, the acquiring company had a choice: renegotiate with me directly or walk away from the deal entirely and eat their due diligence costs. They renegotiated. I received a direct licensing payment separate from my shareholder buyout that I am not going to state here because there's a confidentiality clause, but I will say that it covered the ramen noodles, the Costco trips, the parking garage nights, and a good deal more. I also negotiated a consulting role on my terms, on my timeline, with an hourly rate that made the acquiring company's HR director visibly wince. My father did not speak to me for 4 months. When he finally called, he did not apologize. He said he had hoped things could have gone differently. I said I had too. My mother called me separately, 2 weeks after the deal closed. She cried. She said she had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that things hadn't been handled fairly, but she hadn't wanted to cause a problem. She said she was sorry. She asked if I would come home for Christmas. I said I'd think about it. I have not been back to Dallas since. Wade is still at the acquired company, theoretically, though I've heard from Ms. Odom, who left Garrett Med Group shortly after the acquisition and whom I consider a genuine friend, that his role has been steadily evolved into something with a vague title and very little actual authority. The acquiring company's technical team, as it turned out, was not particularly interested in someone who described himself as a visionary operator but couldn't explain the difference between a training set and a validation set. What I've thought about the most in the time since isn't the money. It isn't even the legal fight, as satisfying as parts of it were. It's the moment in that conference room on the 14th floor when the legal officer turned the laptop toward me and said, "Is this yours?" And I said yes. Just that, without hesitation, without drama, without needing anyone else in the room to confirm it. Because I had known it was mine for 7 years. I had known it in the Thanksgiving parking lot. I had known it in the bridesmaid dress. I had known it in the urgent care parking lot with the fever and the phone in my hand. I had carried it around with me every single day, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the thing I had built was real and it was mine, and nobody, not my father, not my brother, not a room full of lawyers in expensive suits, could change that. Nobody forgets they built something. They just sometimes forget to make sure the paperwork says so. I'm Vera. I learned that lesson the hard way. and I'm the one who made sure it counted. If you've ever had someone take what you built and put their name on it, in a family, in a company, anywhere, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're somewhere in the middle of that fight right now, wondering if it's worth it, it is. It always is. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal version, not the version I'd tell a stranger at a dinner party, but the real sequence of events underneath all of it. My father didn't set out to destroy me. I genuinely believe that. What he did was something quieter and in some ways worse. He just never fully saw me. He saw a function. He saw someone who could build the thing, and he assumed that because he was the one who'd written the first check, the thing belonged to him. That's not malice. That's a particular kind of blindness that comes from never having had to earn something from scratch yourself. Wade never saw me either, but Wade didn't see much of anything that required sustained attention. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's just true. Some people move through the world collecting credit the way other people collect frequent flyer miles, casually, automatically, without ever really thinking about what they're taking from someone else's account. What I've come to understand is that the outcome of this whole thing wasn't luck. It wasn't fate. It was the direct result of choices, theirs and mine, compounding over 7 years. They chose to assume. They assumed the dataset was the company's because it lived inside the company's product. They assumed I wouldn't notice the voting share restructuring. They assumed I was too invested emotionally to push back. Every single one of those assumptions was a choice to take a shortcut instead of being honest, to manage me instead of including me. And I made choices too. I chose to keep filing those registration documents every year, even when part of me hoped I'd never need them. I chose to build something real instead of something that just looked real. I chose, in that conference room on the 14th floor, to say yes when the legal officer asked if the dataset was mine, without flinching, without hedging, without needing anyone's permission to claim what I had actually created. That's the thing about integrity. It's not a dramatic gesture. It's not a single moment of courage. It's 1,000 small decisions made in rooms where nobody is watching. The 2 a.m. server update on Thanksgiving, the patch pushed from a parking lot with a fever, the annual filing fee paid from a checking account that was running low. Integrity is what you do when the outcome is uncertain and the cost is real. And it accumulates. Quietly, invisibly, it accumulates. Until one day, someone turns a laptop around and asks if something is yours, and you can say yes without a single second of doubt. Intelligence, too, isn't just about being good at the technical work. It's about understanding your situation clearly enough to protect yourself within it. I was smart enough to build Meridian. I wasn't smart enough for a long time to see what was happening around it. That gap almost cost me everything. Real intelligence means paying attention not just to the problem in front of you, but to the people and structures surrounding it. And resilience. I used to think resilience meant not breaking. I don't think that anymore. I broke plenty of times in those 7 years. I cried in elevators. I sat in parking garages eating granola bars while a party played above me. Resilience isn't the absence of those moments. It's that you don't let them be the last ones. You get in the elevator. You go up to the 14th floor. You sit down across from the lawyer and you tell the truth. Vera made it out, not because the universe owed her anything, because she had built something real, protected it quietly, and refused to disappear when someone told her to. That's always been the only way out that actually works.